Hello guys, how are you all? Welcome back to my channel. So, today we are gonna see, what if Izuku was born with a sensory quirk, part 1. Subscribe if you enjoy the video. Let's begin the story. Prologue. Song Scarred Soul. Patient. Midoriya Izuku. Quirk. Soul Song. Can hear the manifestation of a person's health and experiences in musical form. Izuku frowned down at his notebook. It had been there all day, empty and staring back at him. If it were any other notebook the page would have been filled in a few minutes at most, but this notebook was mostly empty. Each page held only a few words at the top and a single bullet point. He sighed and shut the notebook when the teacher entered the room. Whatever the teacher started off with was lost on Izuku as he glared down at the closed book. But you're all going into the hero course anyways. And you have such fabulous quirks, but not using them in school. Izuku leaned over his desk, hands over his ears. The music played, regardless of his hearing, but he still tried every time. With everyone showing off, their songs had risen to a fever pitch out of nowhere. Sensei. Izuku groaned. Bakugo's song killed the rest with a long, low note, then rumbled to life, as if to fill the space they left behind. Don't lump me in with these extras. Bakugo Kitsuki was all deep, intimidating notes. His song played like the slow march of a breaking storm. He lorded himself over them, threatening, but not dangerous yet. A bolt of lightning rang in the music when he leapt onto his desk and began his monologue. Izuku's eyes widened as he heard something ominous in his own song, and he cowered in his seat as it grew louder. Aren't you also going to UA, Midoriya? Bakugo's music stopped. Izuku sighed as a sad note began to peal out through the room. The class promptly burst into laughter. The walk home was long and dreary. It took all his mental effort to silence his song, just so that he could have a moment's peace. He didn't need the melancholy background noise to tell him that he was feeling depressed. If you think you'll have a better quirk in your next life, go take a swan dive off the roof. Izuku's quirk came with a lot of benefits. Knowing how a person was feeling and the depth of someone's emotions, having a few moments, in the case of anything significant, to react before bad things happened. Lie detection. Izuku wished more than anything that he didn't know Bakugo's feelings. Hate wasn't the right word. Bakugo didn't hate people. He was determined to grind Izuku into dust through sheer force of pride, just in case people dared to compare them. Izuku stopped in front of the bridge and glared at the pavement. A distant memory played through his mind, playing a deep melancholy sound in between the notes of his song. I'm sorry, Izuku. I'm so sorry. No. I decided back then to keep my chin up and keep moving forward. He stormed into the tunnel, letting his song slowly rise until it matched his determination. Halfway down the tunnel he heard another song slithering through the tunnel, just before his own music changed into something ominous. Without that half second of warning, he'd have been caught in the arms of the slime. Hey, you're pretty good. How'd you know I was here? A chuckle echoed from the tunnel as Izuku backed into the sunlight. I didn't have time to talk, actually. I'll figure your quirk out for myself. The slime grunted in surprise when Izuku dodged the next tentacle and then growled when he managed to dodge the third swipe. Stay still. Izuku tripped and fell, eyes widening as the music darkened. Just before the slime reached him, something new assaulted his ears. The bell suddenly rang through the air. Izuku watched wide-eyed as a manhole cover hit the street and the owner of the new song emerged from the sewer. A drum roll echoed through the street until Izuku was sure that everyone would be able to hear this song. If Bakugo's song was all pride and intimidation, this one roared defiance and tugged at something deep inside of Izuku, as if it were pulling him into the music and grinning ear to ear all the while. A man in cargo pants and a tight white shirt crawled out of the sewer, laughing as he entered the fray. Fear not. Izuku's eyes widened. He'd never heard this song in person, but sometimes, if he talked to the right people, he had heard traces of it. It echoed, even when someone had only seen the owner. I am here. The sludge villain tried to fight, but Izuku could tell there was no point. Heart songs never lied, and he was afraid of the giant man who had crawled out of the sewer. A blast of wind tore out of the tunnel, scattering the sludge and leaving Izuku in even more awe than before. He stared as All Might zipped by, scooping up the slime and soda bottles before nodding to himself and turning to Izuku. Sorry for getting you caught up in that, young man. He got away from me in the sewers. All Might laughed and his song rose to accompany him. Izuku's eyes widened as the hero spoke. Young man? Young man, are you alright? Eh? Izuku blushed. He'd been so wrapped up in the music. Sorry. I didn't mean. No worries. All Might laughed again, but instead of rising the music scratched. Izuku's eyes widened again, only to turn his eyes to the sidewalk as quickly as possible. When he focused on it he could hear something odd about All Might's song. Is there anything I can do for you, young man? Were you harmed? No, I heard him coming. Izuku mumbled. All Might nodded and tucked the bottles into his pocket. Izuku shut his eyes as the wind kicked up, then flinched as All Might opened up his notebook. Oh no. All Might paused with a marker just a millimeter from the page. Sorry, but could you sign this one? Izuku hesitantly asked as he pulled Hero Analysis 13 from his bag and tentatively held it out. All Might nodded, handing both back to him. Of course. Is there something special about that empty notebook? Izuku stared at the autograph for a moment before he closed the book and looked at his empty heart song journal. My quirk lets me hear music. I've been trying to put it into words, but it's hard to describe a person's song. I see. That's an interesting quirk. And that other one, hero analysis for the future, was it? Are you planning to be a hero? Izuku hesitated and turned his ear to the right. He could almost. Young man. Are you alright? Did you get hurt? All Might froze. His music slowed and trailed off, replaced by something Izuku could only describe as quiet dread. Hum again. Izuku's eyes widened. He'd done this before. Mom had always warned him about asking things like that, about people's privacy, and how sometimes it was better to keep quiet. I'm sorry, I shouldn't ask, but on your side, Izuku glanced at All Might's right side and shuddered. I wasn't sure at first, but now I can tell, it's definitely coming from your side. You're hurt, right? All Might's music changed slowly. Izuku was only just now hearing the dissonance between the two sounds, and it was odd. As if the first song was fighting against the second, trying to drown it out. His first song was full of gravity and sunshine and people cheering, a victory, and the wind in his hair. The second song was tired and plucky with long notes and worn instruments. The longer the first song tried to drown out the second, the more it began to fail. Izuku's eyes widened as it missed first one note, then another. All Might stared at him as if he'd stumbled upon something horrible. For a moment, the smile looked more like a marble sculpture than All Might's signature grin. Before he could ask, the hero laughed again and spun around. Nonsense, my boy. I ended that fight in a single blow. Honestly, I'm not that old. Another laugh echoed down the street. All Might crouched and bounced on his heels. Wait, All Might, something. A pro hero battles not only enemies, but also time. Izuku was moving before he could think. Thanks for your support. All Might shouted and leapt in the same motion, dragging Izuku into the air. Somewhere in the middle of their flight a trumpet pealed. That was too dangerous, young man. You could have been seriously injured. All Might huffed. Izuku and his music both wheezed as he got his breath back. But no buts. Izuku's teeth ground together as the tug of war between All Might's songs grew worse. Even his normal bright song was groaning under the strain. You can't. If you leave now. All Might glared back over his shoulder and suddenly his song snapped. Izuku screamed at the noise, watching in terror as All Might began steaming and cursing himself under his breath. The second song quieted down as the steam grew to cover him, and then All Might. Izuku stared at the gaunt man left standing on the rooftop. He couldn't believe that this was All Might, but this music was definitely coming from his side, same as it had before. Calm down, kid. A fountain of blood poured from the man's mouth. I'm All Might, there's no need to scream. The man sighed as Izuku covered his mouth, if only to stop the stuttering. Geez, you're something else. No point in fighting, now. All Might slumped down against the railing. How'd you know about my side? Izuku had to peel his hands from his mouth and his voice was weak when he did. Ah, the music. Your song changed and there's something coming from your side. My song changed. All Might stared at him in disbelief. Izuku sighed, then took a step forward. I can show you. All Might watched him carefully, but when Izuku extended a hand, he took it. Izuku chewed his lip for a moment, then took a breath and pulled All Might's song out and played it aloud. All Might's eyes widened in shock and Izuku smiled a bit. Then, your side. Izuku frowned and reached a little deeper, trying to be as delicate as possible as he pulled out the broken instrument. All Might frowned when he heard the discord in the song. After a minute or so Izuku released All Might's hand and gripped his backpack until his hands hurt. Everyone has a song. They're all different and it changes every single day. Yours, it sounds like someone who's wounded or sick. That's a very odd quirk. All Might coughed. I can see how you'd have trouble putting it into words. I doubt I could make sense of it at all. Izuku bit his cheek. He wanted to say something, but he waited instead. All Might sighed when he realized what Izuku was waiting for. 5 years ago, I was wounded in a fight with a villain. Izuku hissed as All Might pulled up his shirt to reveal the scar. I've kept it out of the media, but I'm only able to work about 3 hours a day. The damage and the surgeries were extensive. But I'm the symbol of peace. Izuku wasn't surprised to hear All Might's theme play faintly behind the rueful song his injury gave off. For a moment it seemed like All Might's eyes were glowing. I will not be stopped by something like this. Izuku believed him. Was there anything else you needed, young man? All Might groaned as he stood up. Izuku hesitated, but in the end, he'd pushed it down too long. Do you think I can be a hero? Izuku asked as All Might stared at him blankly for a moment. I've always had this dream to be a hero, like you, fearlessly saving everyone with a smile. But everyone says I can't do it. Silence stretched out between them, All Might staring down at him and Izuku looking at All Might's feet. After a few moments, Izuku could guess what was coming. All Might's song grew so stressed that it hurt his ears. His own song died quietly, leaving him alone in the face of All Might's answer. I'm sorry, young man, All Might sighed, heroes must put their lives on the line every day. With a quirk like yours, you could surely help people. But, a hero? That may be a bit too far. I cannot ask someone to put their lives on the line for a dream like that. A single, mournful chime rang inside Izuku's chest. I do not think you can be a hero. Izuku couldn't remember the last time he was able to walk without forcing his quirk to be silent. He wondered if All Might had killed his quirk along with his dreams, but that wasn't quite right. He glanced up when he heard the shout, scowling, as he realized that he'd walked to the scene of a crime without paying attention. Explosions and fire rang out from the other side of the crowd. Considering the number of people between Izuku and the fight, it wasn't surprising that he couldn't hear the songs. Large groups of people were harder to sort through. Their songs floated at the edge of his mind like static, waiting for him to poke through and find whichever he wanted to listen to. After a few minutes of dejectedly staring at the crowd, he stopped fighting. He crossed the street and stumbled along the back of the crowd till that Izuku choked when he saw the broad, inhuman grin lacing the slime. Behind the smile was a person, struggling against the grip. Without meaning to, he started picking up on the conversations in the crowd. A few minutes I barely survived 1 minute, how could someone? When he locked eyes with the victim, his body moved. Ashinori stared at the burning alley and the slime villain within. He watched as the heroes were fended off by the boy's quirk even as the school kid tried fighting back. Even if they wanted to, no one on the scene knew how to handle a situation like that. It was a no-win scenario for most. If only I hadn't stalled with that kid. Toshinori gripped his side as he listened to the crowd talk about All Might. His hand tightened painfully around his scar when they asked where he was, whether or not the villain had gotten away. I'm pathetic. How could I? Toshinori's eyes widened when he heard the music. It came from nowhere and everywhere, as if someone had plugged in speakers and begun blasting the song through the alley. At first it was muted, uncertain, and full of despair. Then the strings faded and gave way to a steady beat. The crowd watched as the boy took off running into the alley and Toshinori spewed blood at the sight. As the boy ran, the music grew louder. People screamed, the heroes lunged, and Toshinori felt time slow to a crawl. For a moment, the music slowed and the screams of the people died away, and Toshinori may as well have been right beside them to hear the first boy say, "You look like you needed saving." Toshinori felt something well up inside of him. No. He felt the music pulling at him. The music didn't thunder along with his heart or shake him to the core with its metal. Despite the volume, it felt quiet. Firm. A gentle push on the back. Eyes turned on the horizon, and the dream was waiting there. Feet planted firmly on the ground, moving forward faster and faster until he was running. A reminder of who he was. A reminder of where he had started. One for all burned when he seized a guttering flame and began to swell in spite of its sputtering. The music changed until it was something more familiar, yet alien all the same. If the first had been young and optimistic, this one laughed and charged forward, pushing back fear and doubt through sheer force of will. He felt the sun on his face and the wind in his hair, and even while his body burned and fought against him, the music made him feel alive. The lesson I left you with: I should practice what I preach. He seized the boys just before the slime could hit them and drew back his left fist. A pro should always be ready to risk his life. When it was over, as the police collected the slime and people cheered and talked about the weather, All Might heard the music begin to fade. The song took the feeling with it, leaving him with the unpleasant sensation of holding his muscle form for too long. He watched as the boys were lectured and praised respectively, and his eyes lingered more on the smaller boy. Ashinori had traveled the world over and he'd seen plenty of odd quirks. When he'd been in the hospitals, there were several empathy quirks and endorphin quirks. Mind quirks were rare, music quirks were uncommon, sensory quirks were usually unique and almost always strange, unless they were simple voice quirks. He wanted to say that it was the boy's quirk that inspired him. The music had been beyond him. No words could describe it. Only feelings could come close. Music, ordinary music, did not reach into a person and shake them to their core or fill them with so much passion. Ashinori didn't know what to think of it. He decided it was the boy's actions that had inspired him and turned back to the reporters. Bakugo's song had lost its thunder. It struggled to keep up as the boy walked away. Seeing Bakugo like that made Izuku sad, even if Bakugo was right in the end. He recognized the tune coming from the alley before he reached it and paused. All Might's music had been exhilarating before, but it was more subdued now. Izuku pinched his lip, then smiled. It still sounded like victory. Izuku hid his smile when All Might slid into the street and posed dramatically. With a painful screech, All Might's song caved, giving way to the trudging tune of his secret form. Not 10 minutes later, he made a deal with All Might, completely unaware that he was projecting his song aloud as he walked home. "Mom, what song are you playing?" Inko glanced over at Izuku. His eyes were wide for a boy of 4 years old. Wide, and curious, and sparkling. "Music? I'm not playing any Izuku music." She had looked away from the dishes and watched him tilt his head to the side. "Where's that sound coming from then?" "What sound?" "The music." Looking back at him, she smiled. He had looked as sure as only a child could. At the time, though, she'd been. "Izuku, playing tricks isn't nice." "But Mom, I'm not." "Hush now and finish your homework." Her quirk was practical. Nothing flashy or extraordinary, but useful. Hisashi, for all the strength of his quirk, had never been anything but ordinary. When he was 4.5 without one of their quirks, Inko started paying a bit more attention. He was 6 when he learned how to project. They had seen enough doctors and been through enough exams to know he had a quirk. Each doctor had a different opinion and they were all at least a little bit right. Izuku's quirk was sensory. Izuku's quirk seemed to be mostly invisible. Izuku's quirk may affect other people in some small way. Given Inko's quirk, she never let on how that last one stung. Izuku had been so excited that day, though he wouldn't say why. He'd come home bruised and scuffed up again, but young boys were just like that, weren't they? She patched him up and smiled gently as he bounced in the chair. When she'd asked, he simply beamed the widest smile she'd ever seen, ignoring those times he tried to rival All Might and said he'd gotten her a present. "I want to show you a song. It's the best song in the whole world." Of course his giddiness was contagious and they were planning on going to her favorite little cafe for dinner, so she let him keep his secret. They dressed up and left around 7. After the meal was over, he'd gotten serious. "Mom, can you hold my hand? I think I need to touch you." She'd been confused, but she'd reached across the table. When he took her hand, his face scrunched up. The sound was slow and quiet. Not difficult to hear, but quiet. Strings sang like ocean waves and the wind on an early summer's breeze. A steady, somber beat padded along beneath humming woods and an occasional ring of wind chimes. It sounded like candlelight on the beach the first time Hisashi had kissed her and the way she'd cried when they first held Izuku and made her feel as warm as she'd felt when she smiled earlier that evening. "Izuku, what?" Izuku beamed. "It's your song, Mom. The best song in the whole world." That memory, no matter how many years passed, made her throat hurt and her chest tighten. After that, they talked about his quirk. She learned of all the years she'd missed with his quirk, telling him that he was just imagining things. He told her of all his times trying to understand the songs, trying to show people or put it to words. She'd laughed when he talked about trying to learn some bigger words to fit the songs, only to learn that the kanji themselves also had songs, and those were even stranger than a person's song. After that, she'd watched as he took off learning about his quirk. Staring at his back as he went made the ache in her chest worse every time he learned something new. Because, even if his quirk was something amazing and indescribable and beyond her, something plagued her. Something dark and nauseating permeated every new discovery and little moment that he told her about. It infected every time he wanted to show her a song, every time he asked her for help. Deep down, she knew his quirk wouldn't make him a hero. Sometimes after he went to sleep, she wondered if not telling him was worse than letting him try. She wasn't sure what had changed. He'd come home after the Mudman incident with that old spark in his eyes. It reminded her of the day he'd shown her her song, and that cut deeper than any knife. He didn't tell her about his day. Instead, they talked about the incident and he went to bed early. She heard him slip out early the next morning and she was waiting when he came back sweaty and exhausted. They didn't talk much after that, except when he asked for a few things. Dumbbells, some tracksuits, a different diet. He ate more and talked less. She watched him walk through the house like a zombie and work out even when it looked like he was ready to cry. She asked a few of her friends what she should make of it and they weren't entirely sure what to think either. Just let him be. Even if he can't be a hero, it's good for him, you know. It sounds like he's working hard. Inko knew better. Izuku always worked hard. He confirmed her worst fears months later when she found the application pages among his homework. She'd pulled it out of the pile without even thinking and stared as he did push-ups in front of the television. "Why are you doing this, Izuku?" He came to her a week before the exam, looking conflicted. "You already know, don't you?" She chewed her lip. I saw the application. Would you rather I don't try?" "Izuku, not if that's what you want. I'm just worried for you." The talk was short and they hadn't spent much time together afterward. He was studying in his room and she was staring at the reflection in the silent television screen. She wondered what he had been expecting. Why had he asked her that? For all the years since that night at the cafe, she'd listened to him talk about his quirk. Suddenly she felt like it all hit her at once. Izuku wouldn't look at her, but she realized that he didn't have to. He could hear every word, every thought, because they were woven into her song. Ever since she'd picked the app from his homework, he knew that she was worrying. No. He'd always known. It took everything she had not to break, because she might have broken her son. She woke up the next morning, tired, nursing a raspy voice, tucked into bed with no memory of getting there herself. Izuku didn't avoid her eyes, but he was quicker than usual on his way out the door. As he made his way to school, Inko sat at the table and thought. When she finally got up, she'd decided that, if he was determined to be a hero, then she would match his determination. He needed a mother who could support his dream, no matter what. She would be that for him, no matter what. When they'd begun 10 months ago, Toshinori hadn't known much about Midoriya. Really, he'd known only 2 things for sure. First, Midoriya had a sensory quirk that manifested as music, for lack of a better term. Second, he'd thrown his useless elf into a no-win scenario on pure instinct. Slowly, over the course of their training, Toshinori's curiosity had gotten the better of him. He was raising a successor, after all. Even if he was to die along the way, he wanted to know who Midoriya was beneath all the fidgeting and the muttering and the odd way he looked at people. Well, that's how he thought about it anyway. He started slowly and asked about Midoriya's quirk. Midoriya gave him the name and a short description. My quirk is called, Soul Song. I can hear the manifestation of a person's health and experiences in musical form. Toshinori had hummed and thought nothing of it until that evening when he couldn't stop thinking about it. Midoriya, he'd stopped the boy before training the next day, earning a curious look in response. Can you tell me about the Mudman incident again? Midoriya hadn't really seemed to understand, but Toshinori goaded him into it. Then Toshinori stopped him mid-story to make sure. Wait, how did you dodge him? Midoriya blinked a few times. My song changed, and then I heard his song coming from the tunnel behind me. You said you knew it was behind you because you could hear it, right? Midoriya nodded. So you can hear the songs of everyone around you? Even if you don't know they're there? Well, yeah, Midoriya frowned. People's songs are always there. I hear them like footsteps. As if that said it all. In a way, it did. Midoriya, you can hear my injury from my wound, yes? Midoriya nodded. Toshinori stared at him for a few moments before he coughed and waved the boy down to the beach. Number 3. Midoriya's quirk gave him a lead on anyone trying to sneak up on him. After 3 months, Toshinori was confused. He'd taken to writing the list of things he learned on his phone, and he grew more worried about it with each passing day. Midoriya, 1. Has the soul of a hero. 2. Seems to think his quirk is ill-suited for heroics. Midoriya's quirk, 1. Can gauge a person's well-being, emotionally and physically, after a few minutes of listening. 2. Allows him to hear people coming similar to any physical noise. 3. Warns him of anything important dangerous happening a few seconds beforehand. 4. Capable of projection in small doses and quiet volumes. 5. Sarcastic. 6. Objects have songs too, sometimes. 7. Music can be influenced and so influences the person to whom it belongs. Toshinori was impressed by what he'd learned. More often than not, though, he found himself wondering more about what Midoriya left out. For being a fanboy and obsessing over other people's quirks, the boy had all but written off his own. Just thinking back on their conversation about the Mudman made Toshinori wonder just how much the boy actually relied on his quirk in general. When the boy collapsed, Toshinori wanted to be upset. Instead, before he could finish his lecture, he heard the music again. Instead of the optimistic, steady beat he'd heard back in the alley, Midoriya's quirk played something insistent. It halted Toshinori, and when Midoriya looked up and exclaimed that he had to work harder than anyone else, Toshinori felt the music shake him down to his bones. He's looking that far to the future, huh? When he revised a plan, Toshinori thought back to the slime villain incident. He thought of the songs he'd heard and how it had affected him. Midoriya, would you show me the song that plays when I'm in my hero form? Midoriya looked surprised but excited as he accepted. Toshinori's smile hurt when he heard the music playing. It was the same music that had driven him to save Midoriya in the alley just after Midoriya had given his conviction in words. Toshinori blinked and looked down at Midoriya in shock. His quirk played my own song for me? With that much effect? Midoriya smiled and went back to hauling the junk gladly. He doesn't inspire people because of who he is, he inspires them in spite of it. But that's not quite right either. Toshinori saw a few things that worried him, too. Midoriya didn't talk about having friends. He never spent any time outside of school with other kids his age or talked about anyone but his mother. Sometimes, if Toshinori guided him along, Midoriya would talk about times he went out to learn about his quirk. He enjoyed talking about those little adventures most of the time because they led to him muttering about heroes and quirks and their songs. But they were short and littered with trouble. For the life of him, Toshinori wondered how someone like Midoriya managed to find so much trouble in the first place. 8. Gives subtle information about quirks and intentions. Around month 7, he noticed the music more often. He was surprised by the music and the boy both. Several times he caught the sound just before Midoriya lifted something that seemed a bit too heavy or when he pushed past what should have been his limit. Occasionally, when Midoriya looked out over the ocean, Toshinori felt the music whispering quietly between them. Even if he couldn't understand or put the sounds to words, he found himself looking forward to hearing that music. It happened more when he spoke up and encouraged Midoriya, so he began offering more inspiration. He learned when to offer it and how. He realized, a bit too late, that when Midoriya wasn't letting the music play, he was worried. In the 9th month, the music tended to sputter and died just after he'd accomplished something. Midoriya was guarded and quiet. For some reason, he was more apologetic than before, as well. Toshinori could feel the boy's gaze on his back often, and when he turned to look, Midoriya pushed himself even harder. Whatever was bothering him was pushing him even harder than before, considering his self-destructive nature. That wasn't a good thing. On the morning of the exam, he arrived at 6 to find Midoriya already finished. More than finished. Suddenly the sun broke over the horizon, and Toshinori heard something ring out across the shore. A battle cry reverberated from Midoriya's chest, but more than that his song began screaming defiance alongside him with more body than Midoriya could ever manage himself. It blew like a fierce gale at Toshinori's back, urging him forward. Coals inside of him suddenly blazed to life, drawing one for all out before Toshinori could do so himself. When he caught the boy and looked him over, Toshinori finally realized what he'd been trying to put his finger on for 10 months. 9. He inspires people by being who he is, because who he is brings out the best in everyone. Izuku stared up at the gates of UA, shaking like a leaf. I'm really here. Songs passed by him constantly, all echoing with a sense of awe and determination. A few were laced with worry and doubt. One was definitely sick, that one over there. Move, Deku, or I'll kill you. Izuku bounced out of the way as the storm rolled past him. Bakugo's music had grown even more wild than it had a year ago, if that was possible, but he had avoided picking on Izuku ever since the incident. Maybe they weren't friends, but it was a start. Izuku had always loved listening to Bakugo's songs. Despite everything, it was one of his favorites. I need to do my best too. Izuku swallowed and forced himself to smile. This is my first step. Before he could step forward, he paused. Somewhere, just over his shoulder, judging from the sound, was a song. Normally he would have taken it in and kept moving, but he'd never heard anything like it. Izuku spun around, catching the attention of a brown-haired girl with pink cheeks and a scarf. Before he could remind himself that he was staring and obviously making the girl uncomfortable, the song washed over him. Her song was bubbles floating in a chilly spring morning. Bubbles that popped with a flash and a giggle, like children running barefoot through the snow. Chimes reminiscent of his mother's song broke through, only to be muted when she frowned at the strange boy who was staring at her. Wait. Ah, sorry. Izuku bowed frantically, turning his eyes to the sidewalk. The song was quieter now, and the bubbles were full of smoke instead of light. A deep bass note thrummed beneath her tune that reminded him of Bakugo's thunder, but instead of breaking through the sky, hers clung and drifted like a thick creeping fog of starlight. After a moment, she laughed, mixing the smoking bubbles with the shining ones. But it's fine, please stand up, people are looking. Izuku blushed and kept his eyes firmly on the ground. Good luck, Izuku said as he turned and walked away, suddenly filled with the urge to suppress his quirk until he was through with the exam. He had one for all, anyways. The Chaco watched as the weird boy left. He'd looked really embarrassed, but the way he was staring had been weird. Like he was looking through her or barely looking at her at all. She shivered, feeling a bit violated and a bit flattered. No, she decided. Not flattered. Just weird. Itsuki was quiet throughout the lecture. With Deku sitting beside him, it was almost impossible to listen to Present Mech's explanation of the practical. As soon as the hero walked on stage, Izuku started giving off faint music that sounded like a puppy staring up at a person. Shit doesn't even make sense. Katsuki growled. Deku never made any sense. Not since Katsuki had beat him up and sent the boy home with the biggest smile anyone had ever seen. People around them didn't notice the music, of course. Until they did. Then they hated Deku, same as Katsuki. Whoever is giving off that awesome vibe, please turn off all your music for the presentation. Present Mech shouted. Katsuki blinked. Suddenly Deku was blushing and ducking in his seat. The revelation that the nerd was projecting without thinking about it was new. Deku's music quirk was useless, sure, but why was it changing? Why could other people hear it? Halfway through the lecture, someone stood up and yelled at Deku for being rude to the other examinees, even though the idiot had already turned his quirk off. That was pretty funny, but it wasn't enough to soothe the rage that was starting to build in Katsuki's gut. Deku glanced over at him a few times, worried and for good goddamn reason, before he scuttled out of the theater in fright. Watching the little nerd flee was about as satisfied as Katsuki would get till he got to actually kill things, he decided. Toshinori stared at the screen, watching as the students took off through the streets of the facilities. Every time Midoriya or the blonde boy with the explosions appeared on screen, Toshinori followed them closely. Bakugo, Toshinori had to think about that one, was a star from the beginning. Any robots who got too close were decimated with accuracy and ferocity that was more like an animal than a teenager. Midoriya was flunking hard. If he was honest, Toshinori hadn't expected the practical to go well, but he'd expected a little bit more. Midoriya was running around frantically, not doing anything productive at all. When he heard the music start up from nowhere, Toshinori finally realized what Midoriya meant all those months ago, talking about his quirk. A few moments after the music started up, someone pressed a button and released the 0 pointers. Toshinori focused on ground beta, watching carefully. Quietly the music began to ramp up, changing from something desperate. Is someone playing music? What's going on? Toshinori blinked in surprise as the teachers began searching themselves. They can hear it. Something resonated in Toshinori before he could ask, and he spun to face the screen. Apparently, several of his fellow teachers had the same idea because they all turned to look. Toshinori grinned. Midoriya's song had grown throughout their training. Optimism and determination had been given some spine and pushed to the limit. A frantic rushing beat forced the teachers up onto their feet in shock as the quiet green-haired boy raced toward the robot. What's he thinking? Bachako starred as the creepy green-haired boy began running towards her. She'd only paused for a second, wondering where the ominous music was coming from when the rubble had trapped her ankle. Now she had to be saved by her eyes widened as he ran past her and crouched. The frenzied beat gave way to a long, bright chorus. Some of the frenzy was still there, but the only thing Achako could hear was smash. Between the boy's leap and his fist striking the face of the robot, Achako's breath caught. The music was definitely coming from above, from that boy, and quietly, she heard something come from the rocks beside her. A quiet tune full of awe, and why not? Above her, the boy was ringed in a halo of sunbeams, facing down a massive robot and glowing. When he struck, Achako squeaked. The impact, even on the ground, 10 stories beneath him, his attack created a gale that cleared the rubble from her ankle, caved in the face of the robot with enough force to crack the pavement beneath her feet. A long moment passed, leaving him suspended there in the sky. Achako hoped that she wasn't the only one he'd seen. Before she could be truly grateful, the boy began to fall. The music was back, but instead of frantic, it was insistent and afraid. Achako bit her cheek and slapped the first spare part she could find, pushing it up into the air and leaping on as it rose. For a week after the exam, Inko wasn't entirely sure what to do. She caught him smiling at the fish they were having for dinner, and well, she'd been a bit frantic over the whole thing. He wasn't talking to her yet, but she'd started hearing Izuku's music playing throughout the house at odd times. The sound worried her. He sounded empty. When he gave him the letter and he disappeared into his room, she worried just outside the door. She heard some scuffling, a frantic shout of no, couldn't be All Might. Couldn't be. She didn't stop worrying until she heard the sound of trumpets and pure unbridled joy coming through the door. Quietly, she slipped out and went to buy a little celebration dessert. Divine Quirk, one for all. Inherits the power stockpiled by all previous wielders of the quirk. Can be passed on through force of will. Includes 8 lifetimes of tragic memories and an arch nemesis. Born Quirk, soul song. Can hear the manifestation of a person's health and experiences in musical form. The door was too big. Izuku hesitated just outside the door, staring up at where it met the ceiling. After a moment, he took a breath and shut his eyes and began listening carefully to the sound coming from inside the room. Bakugo's storm boiled, cracking and roaring and boiling upward faster than Izuku had ever heard it. Forget frantic, the song sounded more like a charging army than a drumbeat. If Izuku was right, he was arguing with someone. Beneath Bakugo's song was another, more even melody. Izuku could barely even call it a melody, really. Very few sounds made up the majority of the song. What he heard was light-hearted, calm, and steady. Every few moments, a deep note of disappointment broke the rhythm, only to disappear. Shortly afterward, a few high-pitched notes rang out as the person tried again. He guessed it was someone single-minded, probably dealing with Bakugo. There were a few other songs coming from the classroom. A song made entirely of lightning, firing off so that each arc was a note, and long steady strings of bass notes that Izuku could only compare to cables conducting and playing off every shot. A song that seemed entirely too ordinary until he listened closely and heard something like the steady pounding of feet while men stared at a bonfire. An opera. Yes, that was definitely an opera coming from the back of the room, quiet and high class, but full of cracks. Not breaks in the music, but hesitant moments throwing the entire song off key. Closer to the door was a cluster of students. shouts, and fistfights, and rowing beneath a storm in the sunshine overwhelmed some of the others, forcing Izuku to push through. He paused, watching some of the beats in that loud song skip before he finally pushed through. A song made of bubblegum and electricity, not lightning, but humming live wire kinds of electricity, raced and beat in a steady, constantly changing rhythm. Someone was singing quietly in the background of the others, swaying along to a slow jazz tune checked by what sounded suspiciously like a heartbeat. He listened to that for a moment, reveling in the simplicity and the depth of that song. Near the back were a pair of odd songs. Both were nearly entirely muted. One was a simple set of beats that kept dissolving into its parts, creating little songs within the song for a few moments before they joined the main tune. Izuku took one look at the other song and backed slowly away from the door. "Oh, it's you." Izuku blinked as the bubbles began popping from right beside him. He blushed, half leaping into the air as the cute girl with the strange song appeared in the hallway. On instinct he turned his eyes to the floor and struggled to silence his quirk. Sorry I was in your way again, wasn't I? Oh, no. I wanted to say thanks. For saving my life, I mean. I was worried you didn't get in because of that whole 1 point thing, but you're here. Just like President Mick said. But you had to speak up for me," Izuku stammered, blushing crimson as the girl rambled. She blinked at him with wide eyes. "How'd you?" The girl cocked her head to one side. "Are you playing music?" Izuku froze and stared at her. "Can you hear that?" The girl stared at him. "So that is you? I remember something like this from the exam. Is your quirk music based?" But Izuku stopped paying attention after the first few words. He leaned over, trying hard not to ignore the nice girl. "But is that a caterpillar?" Izuku felt his jaw drop a bit. Whatever the long yellow thing inching toward them was, the girl seemed to notice that he wasn't paying attention anymore and turned. You're late on the first day. That's irrational." Izuku squealed at the comment when the caterpillar turned over to reveal a face. A face that subsequently drained a juice box with a ridiculously powerful pull. You're a teacher." The caterpillar stood up and suddenly changed into a scruffy man dressed in a ridiculously long thin scarf over black clothes, climbing out of a sleeping bag. "What kind of butterfly looks like that? That in the classroom? You're still being irrational." Izuku followed him, staring at the man's back in confusion. For some reason, this man had no music. As if that weren't odd enough, he seemed to force the music around him into submission, muting everyone else's sound. "Are you coming, Curly?" the cute girl asked, eyes innocently wide. Curly, Izuku mumbled, nodding and following her into the classroom. Ioka was used to white noise and hearing things people didn't want her to hear. People were always surprised by how strong her hearing actually was. It bothered her just as much as it did other people, though no one really believed that. What Ioka wasn't used to was suddenly hearing a bunch of strange noise coming from fucking everywhere. Someone had either heard she was coming and rigged speakers on everyone, or the school was under attack. But that didn't make sense because no one else seemed to pick up on it. The only things she knew were that the noises were easily the weirdest things she'd ever heard, save for the unmentionable things she'd discovered about her middle school teachers, and that one boy seemed to have an actual song coming from him, if you could call that weird shit a song. She discovered the second thing by accident because he arrived late. Standing in the same crowd with him made her grind her teeth and distracted her enough that she didn't hear any of Izawa's speech until the blonde bastard screamed "die" and let rip an explosion that would have made most bomber villains jealous. "Glad he's on our side." Ioka blinked as a few sarcastic notes washed over the field. Before she could question the noise, her classmates started getting hyped about the exam, and then the music grew ominous. She glanced over at the nervous green-haired student who'd shown up late and scowled. He looked ready to have a panic attack. "Sensei." Izawa paused in the middle of saying something and glanced over at the problem student. Kyoka grinned at the obvious impatience in his face. "What, Midoriya? I just wanted to ask, what if our quirks aren't suited for this?" Ioka frowned at the question. Even Izawa looked a bit surprised, though he didn't bother with empathy. "This is a hero course, Midoriya. We won't coddle you. Figure it out." "But..." "Shut the fuck up, Deku." Green flinched. Ioka didn't blame him. Blondie seemed a bit, "Hey, isn't that a bit rude?" someone muttered under their breath. Kyoka sighed. "Don't encourage him," Blondie growled, shoulder-checking the green-haired boy on his way back into the crowd. "Deku never knows when to shut up. Apparently, his quirk is the fucking same." Green made a strangled noise and caved in on himself. Slowly, the music began to fade. "So it is him. Fuck. Who doesn't have a handle on their quirk at this point?" Kyoka sighed and decided to just be thankful that the sounds were gone. Any more distractions and she'd have gone mad or tried to murder Deku. Keeping his quirk locked down was distracting. Walking around without the songs in the background was like stuffing his ears full of cotton. Distracting enough that he was slower than he should have been on the tests. Sure, he was above the physical average because of the training. That wasn't enough for All Might's successor, though. Izawa was looking at him too. Not much, but carefully. Once, Izuku let up on his quirk enough that he could check and found Izawa's song to be one of those songs. He sighed in frustration and shut his quirk off, resolving to listen some more later. The girl with the purple hair was definitely annoyed with him. Bakugo was getting more and more wound up. That cute girl kept looking at him funny, and then, in the background of everything was a very angry humming sound that was giving him a very bad headache. Midoriya, a nudge on the shoulder checked him out of his mental rambling. Izawa was glaring at him again. It's your turn for the long jump. His score was awful. Everything was awful. All Might was watching now, hiding because he was so goddamn adorable for being a fucking giant, and Izuku wanted to scream. Watching the bubble girl get infinity on the ball through made him slap himself in the face, earning a few more odd looks. There was nothing he could do about the leak when he stepped into the circle. Nerves had him shaking. Controlling the quirk that people hadn't been able to hear until that day. Impossible. He rolled the ball through his hands, playing back the entire test in his mind. You haven't even tried that yet. Izuku frowned at himself, then looked back at the crowd. But if you do, they'll hear and they'll get mad. Aizawa-sensei already looks mad. If I make it worse, damn it, I don't have time to think about this. The strangled cry escaped his throat and Izuku flung his arm back. His throat and eyes stung. He'd popped his shoulder with that sudden motion and drawing on One for All made his whole arm hum as if he'd just eaten a miniature star, but he pulled on All Might's power. Halfway through his throw the world shook with a sound like the opening of some ferocious monster's maw, devouring every song nearby and dousing the world in dissonant silence. Slowly, he stood up and stared at the ball, at his arm, then looked back towards the crowd. They all stared back, confused as to what he was doing, but he turned just in time to watch Aizawa reach for his scarf. The entrance exam was. The words came out before Izuku could bite them back. Eraserhead Aizawa paused and Izuku blushed fiercely, then shut his mouth as firmly as possible. You were going to break your limbs again, weren't you? Izuku frowned, then looked up at Eraserhead and flinched. If you're just going to break yourself saving one person before needing to be saved yourself, how will you be a hero, Midoriya? What kind of hero are you trying to become? Izuku shut his eyes tight. Even with his quirk gone, the voices in his head and the songs he'd heard over the years didn't disappear. The inside of his mind felt like a raw gaping wound. His heart thundered in his eyes and his eyes burned. Without a quirk, without All Might's quirk, Aizawa blinked. Izuku collapsed as the music returned to the world. All the music, all at once, without warning. Eraserhead's quirk had unlocked the floodgates that Izuku had carefully controlled. Without the balance, the full force of Izuku's song tore from his chest as a hurricane of noise and emotion. The sheer force of the quirk moved Aizawa back a few steps, clutching his ears. Behind him, Izuku's classmate screamed and fell backward. The splitting pain tore through Izuku's head. The world swayed and blurred, but it didn't stop the full force of everyone's songs echoing across the practice field, converging on him as a result of his quirk. When it became too much and his vision started to blur dangerously, Izuku stopped trying to force anything into submission. Instead he forced himself to stay awake, drifting in and out of consciousness as he sifted through the songs and found his own. He'd never heard it so loud or so angry. Hidden deep in his song was the sound of One for All. He'd only had One for All for a month and he'd grown used to hearing it play within his own unique song. Taking a different quirk into his own wasn't as cut and dry as they'd imagined, he knew that. During that time, he'd guessed a few things, both about himself and about All Might. Now he was sure. One for All wasn't just a quirk. They're all trapped. Izuku dug his nails into his scalp, watching as his classmates cried out. I'm hurting them. But the last of his strength he took hold of his song and matched One for All peak for peak. For one terrifying moment he held his breath and drew the vise tied around his heart. Izuku's song paused for a second. 2 seconds. When he gasped for breath again, the sound was gone. One for All quieted, even though it hummed angrily beneath Izuku's quirk. He spared a single glance toward the class. Eraserhead stood between Izuku and the class, staring at Izuku with the eyes of a cornered animal and his capture weapon ready. Izuku tried to stand, to go, and ask if they were alright. The world went black before his first step hit the ground. Let me get this straight. After you cancelled Midoriya's quirk in interest of his safety, and for no other reason at all, you say his quirk exploded. In the aftermath, every single student in our school felt the blow, and each individual was exposed to the power of a quirk that we don't yet fully understand. 2 of your students were knocked unconscious by the noise. Toshinori squirmed in his seat. Aizawa looked about as cowed as Toshinori had ever seen him. That's what happened. Aizawa muttered. What did you say to the boy, Aizawa? Before the incident. I warned him that he couldn't be a hero if he couldn't contain his power, Aizawa said. Toshinori, for the life of him, couldn't suppress his coughing fit. Nezu picked up on it like a hunting animal. Something the matter, Yagi-san? I have some history with the boy. He's got a complex. We met a long time ago when I resolved an incident in town. Toshinori gave a quick glance towards Aizawa, and a nearly unnoticeable nod from Nezu confirmed that the principal understood his misdirection, but from what I understand, Midoriya has spent several years thinking his quirk was next to useless. Midoriya's quirk, Nezu tapped the file on his desk. This explanation is remarkably short. For something as strong as we've seen this afternoon, it should be much more extensive. If I were to guess, from what you both have told me, Midoriya was doing poorly. Between the threats from the other students and his poor performance in the tests, he was on edge. Untold he couldn't be a hero, he must have been dealing with a lot. I can imagine that having less than optimal control over his quirk and being in that spot could create a disturbance. But what we saw wasn't a disturbance. Midoriya is powerful. We must see to it that we guide him well in order to maintain that power. Toshinori sighed. Nezu was right for the most part. But neither of them understood Midoriya. Something told him that getting to the root of the problem would be difficult at best. I would like to be there when he wakes up with both of you. We need a better explanation of what happened from the victim's point of view, Nezu said. Toshinori blinked. Something told him Nezu wasn't talking about Midoriya when he said victim. Ioka hissed as she sat up. Light slanted through the windows, setting the room on fire and causing her to flinch when she caught a little too much light in her eyes. Oh, you're awake. Good, recovery girl. Kyoka frowned and raised a hand to her ear. How long was I out? About 3 hours or so. Between your sensitive hearing and being so close to him, I'm not surprised. Even here the sound was terribly loud. The way recovery girl said it made it almost sound like the most natural thing in the world. Kyoka's eyes widened. That kid, what happened to him? The recovery girl nodded to the other bed and Kyoka turned. Green looked like absolute shit. What happened? Kyoka hissed. Her ears were still ringing from the explosion. The recovery girl sighed. Work exhaustion as well as regular exhaustion and, surprisingly, malnourishment. That boy really, I should have expected as much. He's a troublemaker, just like that other bonehead. But I can't be mad either. Ioka didn't ask any more. I was dissing him pretty hard out there. Carefully, just as her mother had taught her, she played back the incident. Bakugo's shoulder checking and language. Aizawa is getting fed up. Kyoka is getting fed up. Everyone looked at him when he muttered. His squeaking, his frantic chittering. Signs of things Kyoka didn't want to think about. Is he gonna be okay? The recovery girl chuckled. He'll be fine with some rest. I'm more worried about Aizawa than the boy. Now why would you say that? Ioka jumped as a rodent appeared directly behind recovery girl, accompanied by a skeletal man in a suit and her homeroom teacher, who, to recovery girl's credit, looked near dead. The recovery girl sighed and tapped the rodent with her cane. I heard what happened from the students. He needs the rest, so let him sleep. As if on cue, the boy groaned and began waking up. If anyone looked surprised or pleased with themselves, Kyoka decided it wasn't worth it to get involved. The two men and the creature took positions by the bedside and watched as Green started coming to. Kyoka, for her part, laid back down and turned over onto her side. Something told her that she wasn't supposed to hear the next bit, not that she had a choice. Midoriya-kun. How are you feeling? Toshinori asked, worriedly. I'm in trouble, aren't I? Ioka felt her heart freeze in her chest. No one had a chance to say anything before he laughed. The sound was about as broken as could be. I'm sorry if I hurt anyone. Really. I've never had a problem with that before, but it's been getting more powerful, and things have been so busy with the entrance exam I was scared, you know. I didn't think about how loud it had actually gotten, or that other people would hear it, I swear. Midoriya, breathe, Aizawa sighed. We only asked how you were feeling. I'm fine. I'm a little tired. Recovery girl snorted, tired indeed. When was the last time you slept a wink? Midoriya didn't answer that. No one bothered asking a second time. Was everyone okay? Midoriya whispered. Kyora's hearing made her particularly weak against the outburst. She's been unconscious since the incident. Everyone else seems okay, though they were rattled. Oh. Ioka blushed, wondering why they'd lied so quickly. What exactly happened, Midoriya? Asked Nezu. The bed squeaked a bit as he shifted around. Kyoka could imagine him squirming under the gaze of the teachers. I think my quirk has been getting stronger. And I've been worried about it. I was working on keeping it down, but everyone was excited and worried, and keeping my quirk shut off entirely was harder than usual. Then the sheets ruffled, but nothing happened. For a moment, no one spoke. Midoriya seemed uncomfortable, if Kyoka had to guess. Then I erased your quirk, Aizawa muttered. My quirk is usually always on. Other people hear it when I'm around unless I, make everyone be quiet. So, when it came back, I lost control. And I hurt people. What do you mean by your quirk of always being active, Midoriya-kun? Nezu asked. Midoriya flinched audibly. Oh well, people give off songs no matter what, even if I'm not around, but I'm the only one who can hear them. But sometimes people affected by my quirk can hear the songs too. Lately people can't hear them just being close by. I've been trying to keep it locked down, but being here at UA I got a little nervous. Will something like this happen in the future? Aizawa asked. No. I'll get better, I promise. A soft chuckle came from the skeletal man in the corner. The rodent made a small appreciative noise. Then we'll announce that a student had a bit of trouble with their quirk and that we are working on a solution. In the meantime, Midoriya, please feel free to come to us if you'd like any help with your quirk beyond what the hero course offers. Nezu said. Yes sir, very good. In that case, we'll let Recovery Girl check you out and we'll leave you to get home. I'm sure your mother is worried by now. Oh, it's past the end of the entrance ceremonies, isn't it? Quite a bit, young Midoriya. The mouse chuckled. Kyoka frowned. After a few more minutes, the teachers shuffled out. The skeleton stayed behind and asked how Midoriya was feeling, but Midoriya didn't want to talk. For a few minutes after the tall man left, the room was quiet. The recovery girl was making little noises as she checked Midoriya, but I'm sorry I hurt your ears, Jiro-san. Midoriya said quietly. Ioka's eyes shot open. Recovery girl seemed to pause as well. How'd you know I was awake? Kyoka sat up and turned, looking at the other bed. Midoriya wasn't looking at her or the recovery girl. He stared straight at the bed. I could hear you listening. Midoriya muttered. Kyoka frowned. Recovery girl went back to checking Midoriya over and then placed some gummies in his hand and told him to get some rest. They watched him shuffle out, barely standing, and the recovery girl groaned. Those boys will be the death of me. That one in particular. Kyoka looked back at the door, then reached for one of her jacks to twirl it between her fingers. She wasn't entirely sure what to make of it all. Izuku tried, but didn't get much sleep the night after the ceremony. Instead, he worked over old notes and tried some meditation, but his song was too unruly to deal with. Even his usual exercises for calming down didn't even out the melody. Classes the next day were mundane. He'd kept his quirk locked down since arriving at the school, and writing notes wasn't terrible without the songs humming at him from the board and page. Pro heroes moved in and out of the room, each one giving him a different amount of consideration. It took all his willpower not to be sick when he realized what was going on. Present Mick had definitely hesitated when he looked towards Izuku's desk. When lunchtime came, he raced out of the room for the cafeteria. Lunchtime, over the years, had become one of Izuku's favorite times of the day. Most people didn't go out of their way to bother him while they ate lunch, and Izuku could listen to songs when he was finished without worrying about others. He did his best to hit the line early, get through, and find a spot in the corner. When he was nearly through his meal, he felt the hum of someone approaching. You're Midoriya, right? Izuku blinked a few times before swallowing the rice in his mouth and brushing his mouth clean. When he offered a shaky nod, the cute girl with the bubble music offered him a weak smile. Could I sit with you, if you don't mind? Oh, sure. Izuku nodded again. The girl sat down, looking nervous. With her sitting so close, Izuku didn't dare let up on his quirk. She hummed quietly across the table, completely oblivious to the sound. Are you alright? After yesterday, I mean. She took a few bites of the meal, eyes widening in glee as she tucked in earnest. Izuku rolled her question around in his head for a moment before he smiled. Yeah. I just lost control for a bit. My quirk is kind of hard to handle these days. I was hoping to ask about that. What exactly is your quirk? Izuku turned his eyes to his table, then offered the simple explanation that he always gave. It's called Soul Song. I can hear the manifestation of a person's health and experiences in musical form. The girl stopped chewing for a moment, then swallowed. That sounds complicated. So that music that everyone heard, those were your emotions. Izuku frowned. I don't remember much. When I lost control, I think that everyone's music all came out at once. Everyone's music. She cocked her head to the side again. Izuku sighed and dug a hand through his hair. Well, yeah. Everyone has a song. My quirk just lets me hear it and play with the volume a bit. So you stopped controlling the volume and it all came out at once. That's crazy. The girl nodded. This rice is really good. Izuku blinked. Yeah. So, are you using it right now, or what? Huh? The girl took another bite of her meal. Are you using your quirk? I would have thought the cafeteria was a hard place to be for someone with a quirk like that. Oh, I turned it off. She nodded and suddenly veered off topic, asking what he thought about the pro heroes being teachers. UA's afternoon program was hero studies. Izuku had stared at the schedule for a while, wondering what it could entail, before he gave up. In the last few minutes before class started, he shut his eyes and focused. Deep in his chest, his song plodded along without a care. Even with his quirk on lockdown, there was no way to fully shut off his song. What he focused on was deeper than that. buried within his own song was a bit of discord. One for all. Izuku frowned as he listened. One for All Might's quirk was impossible to understand. Most songs had their own rhythms, at most one or two, like that octopus guy, or at most three. Izuku shuddered when he thought of that student. Songs were raw and confusing, but listening to them for a while always gave him some sort of common ground. All Might's quirk felt more like crazy radio static buzzing in the background of his own quirk, adding crazy spikes of power whenever it synchronized with his body. And this was what it felt like when he kept it turned off. He could remember the few times he'd used it. One for All was like injecting liquid sunlight into his veins and riding a tsunami over Tokyo. All Might's song had a lot of natural sounds, like sunlight and the wind in his face. Izuku wondered if that same torrent of power was there or if it worked differently for him. I am coming through the door like a normal person. Izuku glanced up and smiled as All Might strode into the classroom. His classmates were going wild over the costume, the smile, anything about having All Might as a teacher in general. Despite keeping a strict lock on his quirk, Izuku could feel them humming with excitement. Battle training. Izuku felt himself moving through a haze. He changed into his costume slowly, barely even jogging, as he headed through the tunnel. Battle training. Why did it have to be? The light blinded him as he ran out of the tunnel, and for a moment he lost himself in seeing everyone's costumes. Uraraka, he'd finally gotten her name, looked well, she was cute. He didn't bother going any further for risk of completely losing his mind and thoughts. Most of the class looked uncomfortable with him, but didn't bother saying anything. Even without listening to them, he could feel his own song become quiet in response. All Might was making a speech, something about the exercise, and Izuku was half listening. Once you better temper your vessel, you'll be able to use that power freely. Izuku pinched his lip, tuning into One for All's crazed hum. Uraraka nudged him when it was his turn to pick from the ball, which he was grateful for. All Might's eyes gleamed as he reached into the bucket and Izuku decided to risk loosening control for just a moment. All Might's song was the same, as always, down to that painful groan that came from his side and the strain on his song. Izuku knew he was getting weaker with time. The ball came up in his hand and Izuku shut his eyes to focus. Deep within All Might's song Izuku found what he was looking for. He stepped away, holding back tears, as Uraraka bounced and congratulated him on being paired with her. One for All Might only has traces of it left. Like embers, Izuku stared at the pavement, too aware of the worried hum coming from Uraraka. He thought back to his first meeting with All Might. Passing on to me like an Olympic torch, Izuku's eyes widened. All Might thought of One for All as fire. As a torch, a duty, a flame that grew with each person carrying it. Izuku tuned All Might's speech out. His mind slowly grabbed the pieces he'd been looking for and put them together. All Might had One for All, but One for All was a part of his song. The two blended almost seamlessly. Izuku had only been able to find it because of the missing parts, the song humming in his chest, and a lot of stubbornness on his part. Izuku's One for All was chaotic. It was something beyond Soul's song, beyond Izuku. All Might's quirk was like a great, sputtering fire in a midnight blizzard. One for All hummed through Izuku like the force of a natural disaster, spinning together 8 different songs with so much static that Izuku could barely make any sense of it at all. Looking around, Izuku took a breath and loosened his death grip on his classmates' songs. I know I heard one that sounded like he found it. A blonde boy with a song of cables filled with lightning was standing in the crowd, talking animatedly. Izuku listened to it for a moment before he pressed it down. Bakugo was staring at him again. Izuku met his eye and pulled on Bakugo's storm, causing the blonde's face to twist into a sneer. When his palms popped with firecrackers, Izuku heard Bakugo's storm rumble with thunder. For a brief moment, lightning ripped through the clouds in a controlled white-hot burst of fury. Lightning suited Bakugo. His explosions burned, but they were always carefully controlled. Izuku had never taken the time to look at the lightning before. The thunder usually sent him running for the doors. All Might thinks of One for All as a fire torch, something he passed on, but it sounds more like lightning. One for All hummed through him like Kaminari's song hummed, with all the contained power of Bakugo's lightning 8 times over. Calling it a natural disaster wasn't far off, considering what the users were capable of. Before he had a chance to think about the quirk more, All Might called his team. Izuku met Bakugo's eyes. It took all his concentration not to flinch before Bakugo's hate. Midoriya, are you okay? Izuku glanced over at Uraraka, then back down to his hands. He'd been wringing them enough that his arms hurt. I'll be fine. You, and that Bakugo, you know one another, right? Izuku chewed his lip. Yeah, we've known each other since we were kids. He'll know about my quirk. Is he the reason you're scared? Izuku wasn't sure why he was talking. Something about her eyes, he guessed. Uraraka looked so innocent and curious. Bakugo is amazing. He choked out. Quirk, strength, intelligence, he's a really tough opponent. Uraraka hummed. I guess with a quirk as powerful as yours, you'd be natural rivals, huh? Izuku froze. Huh? Uraraka blinked, staring, as if the answer was obvious. Your quirk. It hit the entire school yesterday, and you said that was an accident, right? With a quirk like that, it's no surprise he thinks of you like a rival. Uraraka's eyes widened. A fateful battle between men. Izuku didn't think he was supposed to hear that last part. I'm not Bakugo, and I aren't rivals. I can't even hold a candle to him. Izuku muttered. Uraraka frowned. Have you ever tried? Izuku stopped. He had tried. Back when he only had one quirk, he tried a lot. I mean, anyone who can beat down that zero-pointer is pretty strong, right? Uraraka elbowed him, smiling gently. Indoor anti-personnel battle training start. Izuku focused on breathing as they snuck in through the window. The entire place was corners, but it wasn't hard to navigate. It had only taken a few minutes to go over the layout. When they were inside, he dragged Ichako into a room and took a deep breath. Uraraka-san, Kaken is coming for me. He'll try to fight me. Uraraka blinked. Izuku kept talking. Iida is on the top floor, in the middle. Probably, he'll be ready for you. He's doing his best for this exercise, so be prepared. For now, you should follow a little bit behind me and wait till I lead Kaken away. For a moment, she looked like she wanted to fight him. Then she toughened up and nodded quietly. Izuku swallowed. With her faith in him, he would do everything in his power to win. There was no other choice. She followed quietly, trailing a full hall behind him and peeking around the corners. When he was a fair distance away, Izuku took another breath and let his quirk reach out to the music instead of letting up on the volume. It took more effort than he would have liked, but the result was immediate. Each song hummed to life in the building, giving him an idea of where Bakugo and Iida were and making him all too aware of the gentle pop in Uraraka's song. He paused in the middle of the corridor as Bakugo approached the corner ahead of him. Part of him wanted to dash forward and try an ambush, but Deku? Bakugo hissed. An explosion popped in his hand menacingly while the storm song began to churn with the force of a hurricane. When was the last time Bakugo had been this furious? Izuku couldn't remember. Why had he volunteered for this? The bubble popped by his ear and Izuku grinds his teeth. Kaken, he stammered. Bakugo sneered. How'd you do it, huh? Training behind my back. Were you just pretending all along? Huh? Izuku took a step back as Bakugo advanced. Their quirk is supposed to be useless. He growled. Slowly the storm rose and began to scream. Izuku frowned and stopped backing away. Bakugo stopped advancing. The storm hadn't broken yet. I was always trying to figure it out. I never gave up, Kaken, he managed. Behind him, Uraraka's song hummed with anger and reassurance. Izuku felt a few of the bubbles pop and release more bubbles as if her emotions were boiling over. Determination held her frozen at the corner behind him. Not determination to save him. Determination to win and to trust him. Izuku lowered his stance into something vaguely hero-like, if only he could stop shaking. I'm not going to be afraid of you, Kaken, I'm going to be a hero. You spout all that crap even if you're shaking like a leaf, you fucking nerd, Bakugo grinned fierily. You piss me off. Izuku felt the storm break. Bakugo's rage poured through his song with all the force of a churning ocean, ready to beat anyone beneath him into submission. Izuku saw the move coming from a mile away, grabbed Bakugo by the shoulder, and flipped him. For a long moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. Bakugo fought to stand, staring up at Izuku in disbelief, and Izuku stared back. I'll kill you, Bakugo seethed. Izuku darted to the right, straight down the hallway. Your turn, Uraraka-san, please don't waste this chance. Izuku slid around the corner and booked it. Uraraka took her chance and ascended. He let go of her song and focused on Bakugo, who was screaming something. Really? Explosion was a little too well-rounded. Watching Bakugo chase him by rocketing around on explosions was terrifying. Corners helped, but not nearly enough. Ducking beneath Bakugo as he rocketed around one corner earned him an enraged squawk, but Bakugo still caught up. A high note caught his ear, giving him just enough time to spin and catch the kick on his guard, then pull the capture tape around Bakugo's ankle. Now Bakugo twisted, forcing Izuku to retreat and destroying the tape in one fell swoop. There's that one, but I almost had him. What the fuck was it fun, laughing at me this whole time, you little shit? Bakugo roared. A kick swept by Izuku's head, followed by a grab with Bakugo's left. Every time, Izuku managed to slip out with just enough to spare. Slowly, his song was matching the craze beat that Bakugo was setting for their battle. The songs faded to the back of his mind, twisting into a duet of music that warred rather than harmonized. The storm howled and beat down relentlessly. A single figure stood beneath, facing the thunder and the wind. Slowly his feet sank into the earth, and it was all he could do to fight against the wrath of the storm. He could feel the will to fight wane with each gale, and each inch of clothing left open to the stinging rain, and each time it seemed he would fail, a scene played out behind his eyes. A memory of snow, of children laughing as they played along the bank of the river and of the morning sunshine through the trees. The warmth of a scarf, a coat and a hug. Sunlight and bubbles of laughter. When the boy beneath the storm retreated, albeit slowly, it hurt. When he thought of finally turning and running, that maybe he'd bought her enough time, a hand settled on his shoulder. No one else stood beneath the storm, but he felt it as he felt the sunshine on a bright spring day. The wind of the storm was hot and angry. For a moment, he felt the cool breeze against smiling cheeks, and he could see a clear sky stretching over his city. A laugh tore itself from his chest, despite the rage of the hurricane, and he was filled with sunshine, with candlelight on the beach, and the joy of holding a child, with bubbles of spring sunshine, and laughter. Each song came together at his back, holding him up against the force of the torrential downpour. He screamed defiance at the storm. For years, he'd watched silently as the storm marched onward, always confident that it could destroy him any time it wanted. Once, he'd thrown his life away to try and keep the storm alive. Izuku admired the storm. He knew every inch of the storm, all the times it was sad, and the times it was confused, each time it grew in strength, and each time it was under the weather. He'd run from the thunder, been burned by the lightning, and soaked in the rage and confusion. Every single day, Izuku faced the storm, whether he wanted to or not. Overhead, the storm howled defiance. Behind him, a chorus of voices rose and encouraged him. Beneath the storm, Izuku stood and screamed. He ducked beneath the right hook and swung for Kaken's face. Izuku's fist slammed into Kitsuki's face like a bucket of ice water. For a moment, Izuku wasn't Deku. Deku ran away and cried and took his beatings like a good little extra. Kitsuki had caught a few glimpses of this new person over the years when Deku tried fighting back. Sometimes he'd dodge and swing wildly, but he'd gotten lucky too often. He dodged too well, swung at just the right times. Kitsuki seethed when he thought about it. He didn't like not knowing. Deku was supposed to be worthless, but there was something beneath that. Something hiding behind that useless quiet nerd persona that Deku gave off. No one else noticed how Deku watched people. They were blind to the things Deku wrote in those stupid notebooks. Everyone ignored the nerd and wrote him off, never quite noticing that something was hiding deep in Deku's brain. But the thought of Deku landing a hit on him. The chime interrupted Kitsuki's daily Deku drubbing. He couldn't stop himself from grinning like a maniac. Bakugo began to grin, raising the gauntlet that had chimed. Izuku could already guess what they did. Bakugo's expression confirmed the worst of his fears. He knew he should have been afraid, but instead he smiled. Echoes of All Might sang over his shoulder, and One for All hummed in his chest in anticipation. Izuku watched as Bakugo reached for the trigger and leapt to the side, all too aware of All Might's voice in his ear and Bakugo's response in the hallway before fire engulfed him. The blast roared off to his right and shredded his costume, leaving him maskless and missing a sleeve. Before the smoke clearly reached for his earpiece. Uraraka, what's the situation? Midoriya, what happened? He found me, I'm sorry. But I can't get to him. Where are you? The top floor, near the pillars by the window. Ah. The calm went dead as Iida began speaking again. Izuku blinked the smoke from his eyes and coughed. Bakugo came stalking through the aftermath of his attack, still grinning. If he wasn't tuned to Bakugo's song, he'd have been convinced that the other boy had snapped. Still ignoring me, eh? What, am I not good enough to fight you, Deku? Bakugo frowned and spat at his earpiece. Several notes of displeasure ran through his song before he rocketed towards Izuku in a massive leap. Izuku took a step and threw himself through Bakugo's smokescreen, narrowly avoiding the attack from behind. Bakugo barked in surprise and darted forward. When his left swung, Izuku flipped over his back and grabbed Bakugo by the shirt, hauling him forward and throwing him bodily across the room. Bakugo was shaking with rage as he stood up. Izuku stared at him, waiting. What the fuck, you're nothing. Bakugo roared. You've been holding back for so long, looking down on me. I can't stand you and your bullshit. I was never holding back, Izuku said quietly. Bakugo trembled, slowly adjusting his weight for his attack. Their song was as quiet as the eye of a storm for a moment. But I never stopped dreaming of the day when I finally beat you, either. Bakugo yelled and closed in with an explosion. The storm closed in like a wild beast, intent to make up the moment of silence by condensing into a single massive surge of wind, rain, and thunder. Still, that roar was nothing compared to what it was truly capable of, and Izuku felt the chains digging into the song, as if he'd ever been in any danger in the first place. No one else could feel that Above the Storm was an aria unlike anything they'd ever heard before, so powerful and resolute that no song could hope to match it. Izuku watched in slow motion as Bakugo leapt forward, all too aware of what was coming. He ground his teeth and moved to meet the attack. Songs filled him, and even the storm fell away. Bakugo's fury and despair drummed onward, desperate for the victory he'd imagined. Uraraka's song scratched with each defeat she suffered, and Iida's song had twisted into a farce of a villain's song. Izuku wanted to laugh and show them what he'd heard. None of them, not even All Might, knew the song of a real villain. As if in response, Iida and Uraraka's songs held their breath. For a moment, Deku and Kakin sang alone. One for All howled, and for a moment the world went white. The cough scraped the inside of his throat, racking his body with pain. His arm was numb for the moment, but it was all he could do to stay standing. Bakugo stared at him with wide eyes. For the first time in years, Izuku heard Bakugo's storm fail and dissipate, replaced by long, somber notes of despair. I couldn't use it like this. Izuku choked out. Bakugo flinched. But if it's you, then I can't afford to keep losing. All Might called the match, and the world went black. After getting chewed out by Recovery Girl, seriously, why were old ladies so scary? Izuku stumbled back to class. He opened the door and shuffled towards his desk, pausing when the red-headed boy, whose song sounded something like a team of oarsmen, strode over and caught him. Hey Midoriya. That was a hell of a fight you guys had. I couldn't hear what you were saying, but you were really going at it. Izuku forced a smile and held up his good hand. What is going on? Hey, thanks. Midoriya, your arm. He glanced over Uraraka and saw real concern on her face. Oh, apparently I'm low on stamina and she couldn't heal it entirely. She nodded, not looking entirely convinced he was okay. Suddenly there was another one, a pretty girl with pink and horns and a song that hummed dangerously like an insect's wings. Midoriya. Nice dodging during the fight. Izuku backed up a touch in the face of her grin and the way she was bouncing. Slowly each of them called out a compliment on his fight, or at least a wish that he would get well. For a moment, he was dumbstruck. Then he noticed what was missing from the room. Where did it go? Uraraka noticed him looking and answered. Izuku nodded and darted towards the door. Kakin. Bakugo froze and turned to face him, face neutral. Izuku could hear the storm brewing again, but there was no rage. Dry winds blew, rasping over the strings. Izuku opened his mouth and suddenly he had nothing to say. His mouth opened and closed for a moment, but he couldn't find the words. The songs were like that. Say whatever you came down here to say, Deku. I can't. Izuku frowned. I can't explain it. Not like that. For all that time you spend writing in those shitty notebooks, you're awful with words. I can show you. Izuku's eyes widened at his own words. He hadn't really known what he was trying to do, tracking down Bakugo, but it wasn't. Bakugo scowled at him. You mean with your quirk? Izuku nodded. Bakugo's growl deepened, then turned into a hiss. What the fuck? What kind of weirdo uses his quirk to explain shit, Deku? Izuku didn't bother answering. He reached out with his quirk instead, carefully pulling on Bakugo's song and projecting his own. When Bakugo stopped growling, Izuku shut his eyes and remembered the song from the fight. As the last notes of the song died, Bakugo turned to him and glared. What the hell is that supposed to explain, huh? What am I supposed to do with your stupid music? Izuku watched Bakugo quietly. What the hell am I supposed to do when I can't beat you? How about that Ice Kid, half and half? I'm supposed to be number one, but why are you always getting in my way? Why doesn't anyone else know? You look down on everyone too much, Kakin. Izuku sighed. I don't. Bakugo spat. Just don't. I don't need you to tell me what I'm fucking feeling. I don't need your help, Deku. I'll figure it out on my own and I'll make sure you all know I'm the best. Don't dare think this is the end. Izuku smiled. Bakugo scowled, but he didn't storm off. He waved his hand as if swatting a fly and he trudged towards the gate. All Might was just a few minutes too late. Izuku chuckled when the giant shrugged off. He's right. This is only the beginning, isn't it? Thanks for watching my video. Leave a like if you enjoyed my video and also do consider subscribing to my channel for more awesome content. See you next time, till then sayonara.